Welcome back. Today we deal with the resurgence of empire in East Asia, which means China, yet again. And we know by now, certainly, that China looms large in our class and in world history. That's true, of course, throughout world history up until the present. In recent decades, China has come back to being one of the world's major powers again. But China, I think, is the most impressive culture, social group in all of world history in the following way. I'm not choosing sides here, just in the following way. Uh, it's impressive in many ways, but I think it's unequaled in this sense. That I think it's the most consistent culture going from the beginnings of recorded history until the present. That's had sort of a basically continuous, with few interruptions, shelf life. Other cultures and empires have come and gone, and China, in one form or another, seems to have endured all the way through, right up until the present, and is thriving right yet again. So, getting down to business, William McNeill, one of the pioneers of teaching, writing world history, in his classic book, The Rise of the West, A History of the Human Community, says, quote, the date 1000 CE appropriately symbolizes a deeply significant change in Chinese social history. For about that time, when the bureaucratic reorganization of the first Song dynasty rulers had taken full effect, China's social and economic structures attained a new and has improved lasting balance between rural and urban elements. That is, between officials, landlords, and peasants on the one hand, and merchants and artisans on the other. So, though this has been a process that we've looked in on already, he's saying here that around 1000, just to have a nice round approximate number, is about the time that Chinese sort of society really kind of was bound together in ways that sort of maintain solidity from this point forward, socially and culturally, but then politically and economically as well. Here's a map of China through the three dynasties that we'll look at here: the Sui dynasty, Tang, and Song. And the map doesn't tell you that much if you don't know the geography of Asia that well, but it is somewhat important. I don't stress this as much as some do, but it's somewhat important in history to know your geography. If you do, it certainly makes it easier to understand certain things. So it wouldn't hurt you if this map doesn't help find other ones to scope out the geography on this here, and again, and with something else if possible. So the first dynasty, Sui dynasty, short-lived, but significant, as it says at the top, and our beloved author Jerry Bentley et al. Says that Yang Jian, the emperor, imposed tight political discipline on his state and then extended his rule to the rest of China. By 589, the House of Sui ruled all of China. So we've seen centralization and unification in China before, but again, from this point forward, it takes on, I think, a more tightly knit, sort of, tightly woven aspect to it. So the first emperor of this dynasty was able to maintain discipline and establish a centralized system of bureaucracy that only gets better over time, as we'll see. China is known for, during this period, large-scale public works, huge architectural masterpieces, palaces, granaries, which are more down to earth, but of the utmost importance economically and for survival and human flourishing, walls, additions to the Great Wall of China, canals, which primarily means, at least in terms of historical significance, the Grand Canal, which we'll come back to a little bit later, but a marvelous engineering achievement at that point in world history. The Emperor Yang also increased taxation, which we usually think of as a bad thing. I guess it depends on what side of the taxation you're on. But this did allow China to be able to sort of do a lot more. Have a larger military, be able to flex its muscles more, maintain law and order within its kingdom and the empire. But showing us that Chinese history has had lots of bouts of instability. The emperor was assassinated in 604 CE. I'm not going to go into the details for reasons of time, but so China is moving in an ever more centralized, ordered direction in terms of political, economic, social order, but that assassination certainly says something to the contrary. So back to the Grand Canal. This was an engineering achievement that was marveled at far and wide, and for good reason. Think about how long ago this was, and a man-made canal. It wasn't the only canal built, by the way. They built a lot of them, but this is the most impressive one. 1,240 miles long. It was apparently about 40 feet wide, at least in some places. Had roads going along both sides of it. It went from Hangzhou, capital in the south, to Chang'an in the west. So it went from sort of there was basically a southern capital and a northern or western capital, and this went from one to the other, basically. Bentley says investment paid enormous dividends. This investment paid enormous dividends for the future. It integrated the economies of northern and southern China, thereby establishing an economic foundation for political and cultural unity. So the canal linked northern and southern China economically, but what Bentley's saying, and is surely correct, is it also helped to link it politically and culturally as well. This is one of the complexities of studying and understanding history, and that is the way that things political, cultural, economic, social hang together and influence each other. So often something that happens in the political sphere affects the others. Something happens in the economic sphere, as you see here, technological sphere, as you see here, influences the others. So there's kind of a mutual, either mutually beneficial or sometimes mutually destructive way in which these various aspects of history work together. In this case, it was certainly productive and beneficial for China in a big way over the long haul. Bentley, if anything, is understating that quote right there. Next, we get to the Tang Dynasty, the one that follows, a rebel group, and we'll leave it at that for now. Again, showing that there's still some instability, a lot of back and forth, centralized power becoming more effective, but not completely effective if one dynasty after another, however long it may last or however short-lived, falls from power. But a ruler rose to the top named Tang Taizong, who became the next emperor and the founder, beginner of the Tang Dynasty. His rise to power was violent, but he was a very effective ruler, which isn't uncommon in history around the world. So to get into power, he had to, or he did, I shouldn't say had to, he did, although he probably did have to, knock a lot of heads together, and that's putting it rather nicely, but ruled effectively as well. He appears to have led and governed based on Confucian principles. Remember that Confucius' whole philosophy, and we'll see it again later in the lecture as well, his whole philosophy was centered around public service, mostly for officials, but also how individuals in the society had a duty, had duties larger than their own, individual interests. But Confucian educational, the Confucian educational system, which was still around in this time and beyond, was mainly trying to instill certain principles to properly educate civil servants, and Tan was very much apparently enamored of this and stuck to it. So Tang, one of many that we'll see that keeps China on the Confucian path as its kind of official philosophy, particularly for government officials. A transportation network was continued here, more canals, roads, horses, then a system of runners, kind of like a pony express without the ponies, people running with messages and kind of relaying them, and about 9,600 or 10,000 of them employed to get kind of like a mail service before there were airplanes and Amazon and FedEx and all those things. The equal field system looms large in the Tang Dynasty in Chinese history as a departure from what we've seen in other places for the most part, and even a departure from Chinese history before this time period. Although it doesn't last for that long, one could say, as we'll see, that it comes back in the modern world in China. Civil service exams based on merit. This wasn't new. It goes back to Confucius, and sure enough, the exams are based on what? A Confucian education. So civil service exams based on Confucius's learning, the texts that he emphasized in his own thought. Also, during the period here, especially under Tang Tezong, is the tendency of China to look for chances to expand militarily, and it does so, moving into, not without resistance, but successfully in the end, Manchuria, Korea, Tibet, and other areas of East Asia will follow. There were continued and actually increasing tributes here, meaning peoples that were conquered or at least subdued often agreed to be tributary states, as they're often called, which means they sort of swear allegiance to the emperor. If they do that, they're pretty much left alone to govern, as virtually an independent kingdom, as we'll see in Korea's case. It's a good example. But they're expected to pay taxes, tributes, which actually looks like gift giving. It's sort of done in the form of respectful giving of gifts to someone, in this case to the emperor, but it's really a form of taxation. And foreign dignitaries were expected to come to China with bearing gifts, and they better be valuable gifts, and then bow, kowtows in Chinese history, to bow in the proper way before the emperor. So bring taxes, bring gifts, and show respect for your overlord, the emperor, and then you can go back to Korea or wherever else it is that's in this category of tributary state, and pretty much carry on independent governance. Towards the middle of the dynasty, we see, but weakening the dynasty fatally, as it turns out, is a major rebellion by An Lushan, a general, an officer in the Chinese army, but he rose up in rebellion, and he was defeated, but only after 8 years of trying. This is reminiscent of what we saw in ancient Rome, where personal armies warred against the government or warred against each other, and sometimes were difficult to defeat, even though they weren't the official army of the empire or the government. So An Lushan's rebellion was put down after 8 years, but it did leave the Tang Dynasty in extremely weak conditions. Also, nomadic Turks were invited in, mainly at first, excuse me, to help ward off and defeat the rebellion by An Lushan, but afterwards they didn't leave, and this caused social unrest as well. There was another revolt, the Han Shao revolt, which in some ways was kind of a take from the rich, give to the poor endeavor. Nonetheless, again, we see effective centralization, alongside or coming before, and then followed by bouts of pushback against it. So it sounds contradictory, and it's difficult. I think there's a difficult balance here, because we're saying over the long run, we started this very unit saying, so China is effectively centralizing control, and in a sense kind of moving towards perfecting how to make government workable from a central location, a capital city. But then we see examples to the contrary again and again. I think the main point is that in the long run, and maybe this is another aspect of Chinese history that could be seen as incredible, that China is able to sort of snap back in place, or leaders are able to snap sort of the system back into place, even after these sometimes terrible and wrenching revolts and events of great instability. Professor Bentley again says, much of the Tang's success was due to the energy, ability, and policies of the dynasty's second emperor, Tang Taizong. Taizong was both ambitious and ruthless. In making his way to the imperial throne, he murdered 2 of his brothers and pushed his father aside, meaning he just said, I'm taking over. Once on the throne, however, he displayed a high sense of duty and strove conscientiously to provide an effective, stable government. He built a splendid capital at Chang'an, and he saw himself as a Confucian ruler who heeded the interest of his subjects. So he was an enlightened ruler, but one who could and would be violent when he felt he needed to be. It's easy to look at these guys who come to power through viciousness and cruelty and mass shedding of blood as just brutes anywhere in the world. But keep in mind the time period. There weren't too many kings, emperors worldwide. They got to power by being nice. There are a few examples of kings getting elected, for instance, by their people, or at least by leaders amongst the people, representing the people, but not too many. Most of the time, it's a rough, tough, in some cases, I'm not saying here, a homicidal maniac who gets everybody else out of the way because he can. So whether it's Europe, Asia, the Middle East, wherever else it is, it's the norm for leaders to come to power by through brutality and force. It was the way things worked when we go that far back into history. On Lushan's rebellion, mentioned before, Barry Cunliffe, who I've quoted before, writing a great book about the development of Eurasia and sort of the contacts between Europe and Asia, says in 1755, An Lushan, a former horse dealer who had risen in the ranks of the Chinese army, proclaimed himself emperor. Building on general disquiet arising from the excesses of the Tang court, he led a rebellion that was to last for 8 years. Excesses of the Tang court means that the starving or poor peasant masses were increasingly angry at a monarchy or a royal family living in splendor while seemingly oblivious to the plight of the poor, which also happens a lot in world history. Although the Tang dynasty survived, the economic infrastructure of the country had been greatly weakened, and the unity of the state had been shaken. Strong central rule had broken down, and instead the country was divided into some 40 semi-independent governments under military control. So there's a little more specifics on centralized rule temporarily, again, breaking down. The equal field system that comes during the Tang, I'll let Bentley start us off here. Its purpose was to ensure an equitable distribution of land and to avoid the concentration of landed property that had caused social problems during the Han Dynasty. Through favors, bribery, or intimidation of administrators, influential families found ways to retain land scheduled for redistribution. Nevertheless, during the second half of the Tang Dynasty, the system provided a foundation for stability and prosperity in the Chinese countryside. So, what is this? What will we call this today? Yes, you said it. Socialism. And since in the 20th century into the 21st century world in China, we know that socialism has been a thing. One has to sort of wonder, even though this went away for a long time, how much it may have had an influence on what comes about in the 20th century. I'm not saying this is the same as modern socialism in most ways, but it has certain elements to it here. Right? The redistribution of property, especially by force or coercion, meaning people aren't asked they want to give the property, they're told, and it can be enforced, and is enforced, is one of the hallmarks of socialism. This is, I think, an interesting case to study. I think it's pretty clear that worldwide, this is my own viewpoint here, but socialism has failed wherever it's been tried. This might be the one exception I can think of that is would be interesting and worth studying. If you're interested in socialism and whether it's workable or not, I would look to the equal field system and see how that was done and why it seems to have worked, why it didn't in the end last, and so forth. Civil service based on merit. Again, we've already introduced this, but just a little more on it. From Bentley, again, the Tang Dynasty relied heavily on a bureaucracy based on merit, as reflected by performance on civil service exams from the ranks of candidates who had progressed through the Confucian educational system and had mastered a sophisticated curriculum concentrating on the classic works of Chinese literature and philosophy. So first, this is continuing the Confucian tradition of remember, Confucius' whole philosophy in many ways was centered around training gifted and good civil servants to run the country effectively. So, and China is way ahead of the world on this. The Western world, Europe and the United States, don't start doing this kind of stuff until like the 19th century, even the late 19th century at that. This is hundreds and hundreds of years before most countries in the world even considered the possibility, even thought of the possibility of giving important jobs in administration and government to the people that were most qualified based on their education and their performance on exams after their education. Seems pretty common sense to us today, but most of the time people got their positions in government worldwide at this time and well after because of who they knew, what family they were born into, etc. Sometimes that meant they got good candidates, but sometimes they got poor ones. Some rich guy from the nobility might have an elder son that he's able to use his influence, his social standing, power to get into an important job position, and it's possible the son is incompetent and not good at it. Now, of course, even through a system that it's basically like ours today that requires education, degrees, exams, etc., you still find incompetent people in every profession here and there. So it's certainly not perfect, but it's way better, I think, than the system that the rest of the world was still going by at the time when China had already done something of incredible value. This is one of, I think, the most effective ways to show the ways in which China sometimes just does jaw-dropping things in terms of sort of the sophistication of its culture and society. This one is way ahead of the curve. There's a second point I think that needs to be made here. If the Confucian educational system lasting through and beyond the Tang Dynasty is primarily focused on educating future civil servants, meaning having government jobs. They're like, pushing paper and sometimes making policy, but administrative jobs, government jobs, making political, economic policy decisions. Why would the curriculum in school concentrate on the classic works of Chinese literature and philosophy? What do literature and philosophy have to do with policy and economics and lawmaking, etc., administrative procedures, policy? What does it have to do with that? Well, it's seemingly nothing, but it's surprising when you look at here and later on other places in the world where this is done, and it works apparently extremely well. The British do something like this later on. In fact, up until the 20th century and beyond, the British ruling classes, the elites, sent their mostly young men to Oxford and Cambridge. They sent them to study, what they mainly studied, if they wanted to go into a government career, was literature and philosophy, reading the classics of, in the British case, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and Enlightenment works, after the 18th century. In China, of course, it's the 4 books from the ancient Chinese culture. But nonetheless, we get back to the question, why literature and philosophy? How could that be good training for governing? Well, you have to deal with people when you govern, when you're in administration. In fact, it's, I think, one of the most important attributes you need to have to do a job effectively. It's not the only one. And by reading literature and philosophy, it not only just sharpens your thinking skills, your analytical skills, it does that too, but studying virtually anything can do that. But in literature, for instance, you end up, at least if you're reading the great works of literature, wherever it is, whenever it is, what part of the world it is, it doesn't matter. You're coming across writers who understand human psychology, however intuitively, sometimes by training, I guess. And so you're learning all sort of the personality and character types, and you're learning how sort of people get along in the world. And you might say, which would be a valid point, well, I can just do that on my own, in my own life, by the people I meet, and sort of paying attention to who does what and what kind of personality they seem to be like, and this person seems to be like that person, or this person seems to be like my uncle, realize until you put things together about how life works and personalities interact, people interact by your own experience. True. But by adding literature, it's kind of like you're doubling, tripling, quadrupling the number of people that you can meet that give you that kind of psychological insight. So I think literature and philosophy are much better subjects as a curriculum to study for governing than I think it would be than most people would recognize. The Chinese system worked. It produced really good, effective, talented governors, and so did the British system later on. And there are some others in the world too we won't go into. As far as military and foreign policy in the Tang, Bentley again, soon after its foundation, the powerful and dynamic Tang state began to flex its military muscles. In the north, Tang forces brought Manchuria under imperial authority and forced the Shilla kingdom and Korea to acknowledge the Tang as overlord. To the south, Tang armies conquered the northern part of Vietnam. To the west, they extended Tang authority almost as far as the Aral Sea and brought a portion of the high plateau of Tibet under Tang control. Territorially, the Tang Empire ranks as one of the largest in Chinese history. You can see from the map at the bottom, barely, the Tang is in the bright yellow, and they extended the empire way to the west. That's the part that's almost to the Aral Sea, but into Indochina as well, and even into northern Tibet and Manchuria in the north. So there was a lot of military aggrandizement during this kingdom, and this extended the tributary system. China began to be known as, and think of itself as, the Middle Kingdom. Yes, that's what they call it, the Middle Kingdom. As funny as that may sound. And its tributary system, or the people around it, that basically agreed to recognize the emperor as their overlord and themselves as a vassal to that emperor. And the areas in gold around on the map in gold around the bright yellow were all tributary states at one time or another, or brought in during this time. Again, Korea is maybe the most talked about example of it, which we'll come back to. But you see on the left a picture of different, I don't know who it is, might be fictional in this sense, in this case, but the kind of the process, the formal process and ceremonies involved in kowtowing before the emperor and paying tributes, giving gifts, and sort of behaving with the proper etiquette and protocol and respect before and to the emperor. We now move to the Song dynasty, the third of our kingdoms here, changes in government in China. All of them, right, basically retained the same structure and institutions, like the administrative institutions, tax system of the others. So it's not as tumultuous as it might sound. I'm not saying it's not tumultuous at all, simply because if one family unseats another one, this is happening oftentimes here, one group from a regional area of China unseats the leaders that came originally from a different area of China, there's still some continuity in the sense that the institutional structure is pretty much the same. Now, sometimes one empire, one ruler emphasizes one thing more than something else, so the institutions do change in their importance and in their functions, in the way they do things to some degree. But there's still an underlying continuity and similarity. So this, I think, needs to be understood as well. So the next sort of crucial emperor here is Song Taizu, who you see here. He subsidized warlords. I'm sorry, subdued warlords. Subsidized. That wouldn't have worked very well. I could have tried that, I guess. But this then is alluding to the fact that before the Song was established by this emperor, there had been another period of relative decentralization and feuding local regional warlords. So the first thing he had to do to acquire power and keep it was subdue them by force. And so once again, a lot of bloodshed and knocking of heads in order to bring the centralized hierarchical kingdom back. He greatly enlarged the already pretty large bureaucracy, which ended up being both a blessing and a curse. It was quite expensive. The larger your bureaucracy, the more civil servants you have to pay, and the more bills you have to pay overall. But China was definitely more effectively centralized than ever under the Song dynasty. What you see here was a pretty long-lived dynasty. It lasted for a number of centuries. But there were problems, and the decision-making from the top wasn't always sound. Oftentimes, bureaucrats in regional areas were allowed to lead armies, which ended up sort of boomeranging back on the dynasty. China, what else is new? Can't stop the nomads, but during this period, they became increasingly difficult to maintain. The nomads from the north are still the big thorn in the Chinese government's side. As James McClellan says in Science and Technology and World History, centralization of power in the hands of the emperor and rule by a governing bureaucracy, the mandarinate, as it was known, reached new heights under the Song. The bureaucracy consisted of 100,000 civil servants, allowed direct control by the emperor down to the village level. No intermediary or independent bodies existed in China to challenge the authority of the emperor or the mandarinate. So first, the mandarinate. Mandarins is a term for elites, and these are really nobles, people from wealthy families with a long family history of being rich and powerful, old money families, not somebody making a fortune in the recent past, but families that have been rich and powerful and handed their big pieces of land and estates down generation after generation, and they stay powerful with huge social status. And the governments, the emperors, in this case Song Taizu, leaned on them because they were generally the ones that got the Confucian education, basically a college degree, and were sometimes the brightest people in the room. So this is now streamlined even more and enlarged than ever before. The Mandarins, as we'll see, will eventually come into they'll have a rival in advising and being administrators for emperors, but we'll save that. To say that this all gave the emperor direct control down to the village level meant that there was sort of no separation of powers, at least in a vertical sense, really not in a horizontal sense either. In our system, for instance, just to give us something to play this off of, today in the United States, we have federal government, state government, and local government, and all of them do have some rights and areas of independent operation outside of the other, in resistance to the other, doing things, their own way. This wasn't true in China here at this time. The emperor could and sometimes did have an impact down at the village level. So there weren't really any local institutions. There would be later on, but not now, and regional institutions beyond the regional nobles. But in a sense, the emperors of the Song are effectively subduing noble power in order to get this sort of channel of power straight from the emperor all the way down to the village level without any intermediaries in between. There was a Chinese golden age during the Song dynasty, particularly with regard to technological or architectural achievements in the arts in general. The civil exams, of course, continued, civil service exams. So McClellan, again, on this, the Song dynasty and the Renaissance accompanying the Song command attention. In many ways, the Song period represents the zenith of traditional China. The several centuries of Song rule form the golden age of science and technology, and they provide an effective point of contrast with contemporary developments elsewhere in the world. So he's giving China a deserved compliment there, saying that its culture was astonishing in its vibrance during this period. We see some of the architecture and cultural achievements, technological ones there, shipbuilding being one of them, which we'll come back to. Urbanization and population growth is happening during this period as well. Ian Morris, in his fantabulous book, "The West, Why the West Rules for Now," and the very title meaning that China is the country that's on the rise and likely to become #1 in the world again sometime soon, says, for the 1,000 years leading up to 1700, the biggest cities were clearly Chinese, with Japanese ones often close behind. First Chang'an, then Kaifeng, and later Hangzhou came close to or past 1 million residents between 800 and 1200 CE. Western cities, by contrast, were never more than half that size. There weren't many of them at that in the West. Ian Morris, in this and other books, uses a metric for what he calls social development. How socially developed is a society, is a culture. And one of the metrics he used is the size of cities. There's 4 metrics overall that he uses to sort of see social complexity and social development. So during this period, not surprisingly, in this corner of social development, one of the 4 pieces he uses to assess this, China is far and away the leader. So population was growing, and partially in relation to it, cities were growing. Over 1 million, right? That's around the year 1000 to have a city of 1 million or more already. That's just astounding. Patriarchy in Chinese culture. We know that Chinese culture, like almost all cultures throughout the world that long ago, were they kept women down, kept women from being involved in any kind of male activities, with rare exceptions, politically or economically speaking. And the patriarchy in Chinese society, from our modern viewpoint, can look and is particularly cruel. So Professor Bentley, again, talking about in general, a misogynistic system that kept women under the control of men, and then more specifically about the Chinese practice of foot binding, says Tang and Song, China experienced a tightening of patriarchal social structures, which perhaps reflected a concern to preserve family fortunes through enhanced family solidarity. During the Song dynasty, the veneration of family ancestors became much more elaborate. So that we know that goes deep, deep back into the Chinese past. A big part of religious worship and ceremonies is worshiping your ancestors. Now, during this period, more of it is by going out to like the grave site of ancestors and having services and ceremonies there, rather than in the home or somewhere else. He goes on to say that strengthened patriarchal authority also helps to explain the popularity of foot binding, which spread widely during the Song era. Women with bound feet could not walk easily or naturally. Like the practice of veiling women in Mediterranean and Muslim lands, foot binding placed women under tight supervision of their husbands or other male guardians, who then managed the women's affairs in the interests of the larger family. And if you look it up, and it's kind of gruesome to do, you see that the drawing on the left there of the woman's foot or feet is actually not inaccurate. They wrapped them so often and so tightly that it deformed the growth of the foot. And so you have these little tiny feet. I don't mean that they're just miniaturized and small. They're mangled. They become small, but it's not that the foot binding just miniaturizes them. It miniaturizes them by mangling them and sort of having toes kind of crumpled together, sort of as a unnatural growth. So it's certainly was a cruel practice, and must have been incredibly painful. And it's clearly, right? It had other more subtle features to it, but most obviously, and certainly true, is the fact that if a woman has feet that are tiny and they're painful to walk on because they've been deliberately misformed or deformed, then a woman is going to have a much harder time getting around and getting away from her husband or whatever males in the family she's supposed to, be under, control of. So this is the most striking, in some ways, most unique aspect of Chinese patriarchal culture throughout their history. The late emperor Wu Zhao, what an incredible story. And our textbook goes into a little of this, but not too much. It's interesting to read about if you find a book that can give you more depth. But she's also known as Wu Zetian, daughter of a local official. So her father was someone of some importance. She became a concubine at the royal court. Emperors had concubines, meaning they had multiple women at their disposal, like a harem, when they wanted them. But she attracted extra notice due to her intelligence, wit, and beauty. She became kind of a legendary figure in Chinese history. She eventually became the concubine of the emperor himself, and then his wife. The emperor was so taken with her that he made her his wife. And when the emperor had a stroke, she ended up running the government. When the emperor died, she claimed the imperial title for herself. And though there was much opposition, she actually pulled it off and ruled as emperor or empress for years. She shrewdly organized secret police, brutally crushed dissent. She understood that as a woman, she had enemies. There was tons of opposition to her, plots and attempts to take her out of power. In a misogynistic, male chauvinist society, they're not going to take it well. Many people aren't anyway, when there's a woman at the top as empress. So she had to be very adept, very clever. She was, and be brutal to survive. And she was all of those things. But she ruled effectively as well, by strengthening the civil service even more, patronizing the Buddhists, meaning helping to fund them and support them, putting down rebellions, organizing foreign military campaigns. She opened administrative positions to talented commoners, which really hadn't been done before. There was probably an occasional one here or there, but now allowing them the Confucian educational system training civil servants, which was a ticket to an elite life, to talented common people that weren't born into the right families. So this was incredibly, I think, important reform, because it just increases the talent pool. So brings even more effective governors, administrators. She was finally forced out of power at age 80, incredibly. And so our text says, an energetic and effective ruler, a woman who publicly and officially wielded power in a rigidly patriarchal society. Other women exercised influence indirectly, or even ruled from behind a screen, so to speak. But Wu Zhao was the only woman in Chinese history to claim the imperial title and rule as emperor. So an extraordinary figure in Chinese and world history. Technological development was at a premium in the Song dynasty. All kinds of technological achievements, many of which were copied by the rest of the world. Europeans, the Arabs in the Middle East, other groups further to the west, or at least to the west of China. Information technology among them. As Ian Morris says, Chinese artisans first made paper from mulberry bark in 105 CE, and wood pulp paper was common by about 700. Arabs learned of paper around 750, but Italians started buying it from them after 1150 and making it on their own by about 1276. By then, Chinese publishers had been using engraved wood blocks to print paper books for 5 centuries, and using movable type for 2 centuries. Europeans only borrowed or reinvented woodblocks around 1375 and movable type around 1430. So a remarkable technological advance, and again, way ahead of the curve, ahead of the rest of the world. You also see here gunpowder weapons, primitive cannon in the upper left. The Chinese pioneered gunpowder technology, cannons, rifles, equivalent thereof, iron smelting, iron making, so metallurgy, pottery, ceramics, porcelain in this case, became in huge demand on world markets. And in the upper right there you see an example of sort of the block printing methods, the technology there. So that and many other things are part of the renaissance of the Song dynasty, the golden age. Shipbuilding is another aspect of the golden age. Bentley says the Song dynasty reimposed centralized imperial rule in the late 10th century. Though it survived for more than 3 centuries, the Song dynasty never built a very powerful state. That's somewhat open to question, and different historians have different takes on it. Bentley, of course, has one. Song rulers mistrusted military leaders, and they placed much more emphasis on civil administration, industry, education, and the arts than on military affairs. Now, that part is true, and this is what Bentley means when he's saying they didn't build a very powerful state. They built a strong centralized state in terms of adding on and supplementing, strengthening the administrative system, the political institutions, economic institutions, educational institutions, but they didn't do very well when it came to military affairs, as we talked about briefly in the slide, handing too much military decision-making power over to administrators, and sometimes at the regional level, which ended up proving a big problem. As far as economic development is concerned, this is a very general statement about both the Tang and the Song dynasties. Maybe most importantly, I guess easily the most important, they put to use a new fast ripening rice. You could have 2 crops each season instead of 1. So crop yields went up accordingly by a great deal. And of course, more food almost anywhere and everywhere in world history means larger population. We know that was a formula way back in Chinese history. In a previous unit, we learned that the sort of formula of emperors for a long time had been, right, you want more land, you want higher crop yields, so you can have higher population, so you can draft more men into an army and have overwhelming numbers when you go into battle against the enemy. The Chinese also learned to grow cotton. They had already been producing tea, but in this era, they increased production of tea by a pretty large amount. Forget the number, the estimated number. And agricultural surpluses, partly because of the fast ripening rice, meaning you have more than you can consume. Increased taxation. It also increased trade. So just fast-growing rice alone, as a singular economic development, had a tremendous positive impact on not just the economy, but again the spillover effect we talked about before into politics, into economics, society, culture, population, etc. And we also see the beginnings of a market economy in China during these dynasties. William McNeill saying that in a year of normal harvests, full efficiency provided the imperial court with more grain and other foodstuffs than it could use. By about the middle of the 8th century, therefore, imperial officials began to exchange surplus grain for various luxury goods. The effect was to create or vastly expand a market for the most highly skilled artisan wares, fine silks, porcelains, lacquerwork, and the like, in all regions of China. A substantial enlargement of the artisan and merchant classes naturally ensued, as well as regional specialization. So again, there's a lot of synergy going on here, a lot of mutually reinforcing elements to all this. But just from that short statement alone, I think you can see that the economy is just sort of taking off in multiple ways and for multiple reasons, but all, again, mutually reinforcing. So market conditions, a market economy is on the rise in China, and this also helps to explain Chinese overall power and number one presence in terms of power, its economy in Asia. High productivity, according to Bentley, in trade brought the Tang and the Song economy a dynamism that China's borders could not restrain. Chinese consumers developed a taste for exotic goods that stimulated trade throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere. Spices from the islands of Southeast Asia made their way to China, along with products as diverse as kingfisher feathers, tortoiseshell from Vietnam, pearls and incense from India, horses and melons from Central Asia, which became the symbols of a refined, elegant lifestyle. So a vibrant trade is also another feature of China's growing market economy. It's the West, of course, Europe and the United States that are usually thought of as sort of the countries that kind of invented the market economies, but not so. China had a thriving one already by this time here. And I said a number of slides back when referring to the equal field system that it's an interesting experiment in socialism in China, but by this time, right, now China's economic system has moved in a different direction. You can't have an equal field system and property divided at least relatively equally within a market system. Those two just don't go together. So it'd be interesting, and I've done it a little bit, but to sort of compare the equal field system earlier in this era with the market economy that's becoming increasingly dominant and effective in this latter era. Also, economically, and this is of great significance, the beginnings of a money economy. McNeil. Although coins had been known in China for centuries, they came into widespread use only after the convenience of converting tax income into a standard, easily transportable measure of value became apparent. Official figures show that in the year 749, only 3.9% of the government's income took cash form, whereas by 1065, this figure had risen to 51.6% of a greatly enlarged economy. So in a fairly short amount of time, from historical perspective, you see China moving from basically a barter economy to a money economy. And not mentioned in this quote, but mentioned in our textbook, is the fact that by the Song, they were also issuing notes, paper money as well. And when an economy gets big enough, it's got to have paper currency, and it's got to have increasingly sophisticated economic and sort of monetary institutions and mechanisms, or it just can't keep up. So in history, whenever and wherever it occurs, the move to a money economy is of tremendous importance. It changes a great deal, and it usually means that that society, its wealth is growing, and that it's, with now the monetary system they have in place, it's going to continue to grow. Among other things, being able to buy with money, which is just like a no-brainer for us today, but keep in mind, you didn't invent it, neither did I. So, but once it happens, you realize how necessary it is if you look back, because what about when you needed a product and you didn't have money? There was no money. So I may have used this example in class before, forgive me. I know I used it sometime this semester. I forget if it was your class, but it's worth repeating here that if you're you own an apple orchard and you have some dental work that needs to be done, you have a root, you have a tooth that's killing you. I mean, it's a root canal you need, but you don't know that at first. So you decide to go to the dentist, but there's no money. I mean, it hasn't been invented yet. What do? Take a barrel of apples 5 miles into town, or in a wagon, 5 miles into town, stop off at the dentist and say, "Hey, Mr. Dentist, would you pull my tooth? Give me a root canal if I give you this basket of apples?" Well, okay, I mean, could work, but what if he doesn't want the apples? What if he doesn't need the apples? What if he says, "Hey, I'd love to, but it's bad luck for you"? What do you mean? Well, just about an hour ago, another guy that owns an apple orchard came and needed his tooth pulled, and he brought me a wagon of apples already. I don't need any more apples. So you don't have any thing to exchange with him for the service that you desperately need, because what you have are apples. So trade and barter, of course, can work. It worked for thousands of years before money economies. But money economies tend towards economic growth in a big way, because it just smooths transactions and deals that might not be able to be made, in some cases couldn't be made otherwise. So this again, whenever and wherever you see it, the move to primarily or exclusively a money economy is a big step forward in terms of complexity and economic development. The establishment of Buddhism in Tang and Song, China. So Buddhism had already been around in India. There were already some places in China where it was starting to catch on, but it kind of takes off during these dynasties as well. There are really kind of two types of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, the latter of which generally is more appealing to large swaths of a population. So, quoting from Stephen Prothero, who I have used before as an expert on religion in his great book called God is Not One, says Mahayana Buddhists gave the world a radically new interpretation of the Buddha. Mahayanists came to see him as eternal and omniscient, a supernatural being who could answer prayers and reward devotion. With the emergence of the Mahayana school, Buddhism moved undeniably into the family of religions, meaning this made it a religion that was likely to become popular and would grow to become, a world religion. It's not considered a world religion if 4 people, adhere to it. And what he's saying is that, among other things, what the Mahayana Buddhists did that their counterparts did not, is they made the religion easier to practice, so that it's appealing to more people. The other elements of Buddhism, other brands, so to speak, were more taxing, required more commitment, were harder to do, required more discipline, more effort, more time, and so it wasn't appealing to the masses. It was only appealing to those who could and would make the full commitment. So Professor Bentley says, in Mahayana Buddhism, it became possible. No, this is still Prothero. Sorry, it became possible to get nirvana through outside assistance rather than self-reliance, through devotion to a bodhisattva, who's a spiritual guide, who would use his merit to take away your suffering. In this way, it became much easier to achieve nirvana. And lay people became fuller participants in the Buddhist community. That's just a fancier way of saying what I did, which is Mahayana Buddhism, which again kind of takes off in China and is sponsored even by the government, pushed forward by the government, helped by the government, makes being a Buddhist easier and makes it then more popular. That's, by the way, that's true in lots of religions. They have those wings to them that are about or become to be about popularizing, not popularizing the wrong word, making the religion more popular. There was one particular city, a Silk Road oasis, and boy, was it a Silk Road oasis. Right? That's almost the definition of oasis. That's, of course, a modern picture. But a place called Dunhuang, between about a 400-year period, this place along the Silk Roads was a sort of a major sort of point on the map from which Buddhism spread to along the roads, Silk Roads, and then fully engulfing China over the centuries. Bentley, the Mahayana Buddhism gradually found a popular following in Tang and Song, China. Buddhism came over the Silk Roads. Residents of oasis cities in Central Asia had converted to Buddhism as early as the 1st or 2nd centuries CE, and the oases became sites of Buddhist missionary efforts. By the 4th century, a sizable Buddhist community had emerged in Dunhuang in western China. Between 600 and 1,000, Buddhists built hundreds of cave temples in the vicinity of Dunhuang and decorated them with murals depicting events in the lives of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. They also assembled libraries of religious literature and operated scriptoria to produce Buddhist texts. Missions supported by establishments such as those at Dunhuang helped Buddhism to establish a foothold in China. So this is sort of one of the steps along the way of China becoming more and more influenced by this growing eventual world religion. By the word scriptoria means a place where texts are kept, books are kept and produced. And in those days, both in Europe and Asia, what that meant usually was monks, religious leaders or clerics copying texts. The laborious, seemingly boring work of copying texts. Right? They didn't have printers, they didn't have computers, they didn't even have copy machines. No Xerox copy machines. Didn't have presses that could sort of mass produce things. So most of the time you had to write out. Again, the block printing we talked about is a growing exception to this, but much of the time it's still about copying texts by hand. That's what a scriptoria does. Buddhism and its relation to other religions, since there are lots of them in China. Taoism is there, Confucianism in some ways is a religion, in some ways it's a philosophy. So there was a lot of competition. But Buddhism attracted, according to Bentley, Chinese interest partly because of its high standards of morality, its intellectual sophistication, and its promise of salvation. Practical concerns also helped to account for its appeal. In some ways, Buddhism posed a challenge to Chinese cultural and social traditions. Buddhist theologians typically took written texts as points of departure for elaborate, speculative investigations into metaphysical themes such as the nature of the soul. Metaphysical means that metaphysical themes, investigations of this type, means that Buddhism was a religion that sort of delved very deeply into sort of philosophical speculation about ultimate things. That's what metaphysics is. So asking the questions like, why are we here? Is there a God? Why is there a universe? Etc., etc. And not all religions go into that kind of thing as much. Buddhism is one of those in the world that does, or at least some types of Buddhism. Among Chinese intellectuals, only Confucians placed great emphasis on written texts, and they devoted their energies mostly to practical rather than metaphysical issues, which we should already know, right? We know that Confucian education relies on literacy and great attention paid to Chinese literature and philosophy from the past. True, but we also know that Confucius' whole program and philosophy was primarily about training, educating civil servants for practical jobs. So it's not a philosophy religion, Confucianism that is, that's prone to thinking about, why is the universe here instead of not here? That's not a practical question, at least from their perspective. Not going to help to get more effective government, get your career advanced as a Confucian scholar / civil servant. Taoists had limited interest at all in written texts of any kind. So I've only kind of picked one difference here. There are lots of others between Buddhism and the other religions already in China, but one of them is sort of the approach to texts and what kind of questions are asked about those texts and what kind of questions are asked in religion as a whole. Neo-Confucianism was a big influence during these dynasties, meaning Confucianism made a comeback. Not exactly the same, but the core curriculum and core ideas are pretty much still the same. So that part is true. You can see on the right, the core curriculum is still Confucius's own acolytes, Mencius, we talked about before, a guy who came after Confucius but carried on the Confucian tradition. The four books, the Analects, as one of the crucial texts that educated Chinese prospective civil servants are studying and mastering in order to pass their exams and to get their education. So one of the sort of crucial religious leaders of the time, Zhu Xi, you see pictured on the left and on the right, was one of the main practitioners and promoters of this Neo-Confucianist school of thought. I don't mean a literal school, but a school of thought. Confucius' message became a major social force well after his death, according to Michael Mann in the Sources of Social Power. It lasted an incredible 2,000 years until modern times. Confucianism was a marvelous instrument of imperial class control. It appropriated the rationalistic side of salvationist currents, leaving more spiritual, mystical, and turbulent currents to be expressed in quietist private cults like Taoism. It also solved several of the contradictions of empire, which the Chinese Empire was also experiencing. It added universal values and legitimation to a modified particularism of aristocracy and dynasty. It confined egalitarian values to an enlarged ruling class. It provided unified culture to a ruling class otherwise prone to decentralization. And by allowing new entrants into the gentleman category, it could admit educated barbarians into its ruling elite and thus into civilization. these were solutions to many of the contradictions that had destroyed Rome. So what's being said here is, not only is this in some ways a religion, not only is it great training for civil servants that makes government more effective, but that it also, whether it was intentional or not, I think that's maybe not entirely clear. Some features of it may have been, for sure, but that it solved a lot of sort of social problems, and it helped to sort of solidify, unify the culture, and sort of unify sort of social and political, cultural, social, and political life. So I'm simplifying that quote. It would be worth reading again. The development of complex society in Japan. We unfortunately don't have enough time to do Japan justice. It's one of my favorite countries in the world, I must say. I've been there only once, but I spent about a month there many years ago, and I've wanted to go back ever since. And one day I hope I will. But Japan, it says, going back to William McNeill again, offered fertile ground for the building of a civilization, as the successful transplantation of Chinese patterns of court life and high culture to the islands during the Nara period had shown. The Nara period is oftentimes considered kind of ancient Japanese history. Yet the Japanese were not long content with wholesale borrowing. Instead of hastening to adopt the latest nuance of Chinese styles, the Japanese between 1000 and 1500 built a society and culture of their own. No longer a provincial copy of China's imperial splendor, the new Japanese civilization was nonetheless closely related to and largely derived from the Chinese. So no doubt, as Professor McNeill says here, that Japan was very much influenced by China, as all of China's neighbors were. It was a dominant power, but I don't just mean militarily, they're culturally influenced as well. And for the cultures around them, like the Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, etc., to take on so much of Chinese culture, so deeply and so widely and so consistently, it can't be just that they were forced to at gunpoint to take on these cultural attributes. It must have been, and clearly was, that these things worked. They were appealing. Their culture, their technology, their value system, whatever it may be, if it caught on and lasted in another country, in another kingdom, you can bet that it had value to that people, and they saw it and acted accordingly. So the Japanese are no exception. That being said, the Japanese proudly maintained and promoted and enhanced over time their own traditions and their own culture. It was a little easier for Japan than some of the other Chinese neighbors, for the obvious reason that Japan is an island nation, right? Many islands, a handful of major islands, but the South China Sea between the two places gave them a bit of a cushion. Not that they couldn't be invaded, and they were, but it was hard to do. Invading across any body of water is extremely difficult and fraught with danger. So their island status gave them quite a bit of insulation, isolation that they used to their advantage, and were able to carve out their own unique and quite extravagant independent culture. But there's no denying that the Chinese culture was sort of infused and synthesized with that in a pretty large way. You can see it in the Nara period in Japan, the ancient capital, which you see in pictures here. It's a fabulous place to visit. My actual favorite single event for my month-long trip to Japan, and there were many, but was something called the Nara Deer Park. And I was shocked. I'd heard about it before, but I still didn't really think about it enough until I got there. I was like, wow. But they have these wild roaming deer in the deer park, in basically the ancient capital here. And unlike in the United States where we shoot deer, it's a sacred animal there. And so they protect them. And they protect them especially in that park, which is, I think, like, government operated, like a state park. And So the deer are wild, but they're tame. They walk right up to you, and that you can buy little bags of food, and they'll come right up to you. They actually get with their horns kind of aggressive, and it's kind of in some way they don't really harm you, but it's kind of scary because they'll come crowding around you. Sometimes some of them with horns, and they'll be nosing in, trying to bump another one out of the way to get your, the nuggets of food that you're feeding them. But it's incredible. You can hold food in your hands, and the deer will eat right out of your hands. They don't run off. Here we're lucky to even see a deer. Even if you're a deer hunter, it's only so often that one comes into view. But in Japan, you go to the Nara Deer Park, and they're all over the place, roaming wild. They kind of walk down the streets with you. If you've got food, they don't really want any part of you. If you don't have food, but it's an incredible experience. So Nara is a very wonderful place to visit. With deep history, tradition, that's culture that's fascinating. McNeil says one of the aristocratic clans in Japan insisted on its precedence over the others, although in fact it had never wielded effective authority outside its territory in central Japan. That's deliciously vague, but let's just leave the family untalked about for now, just to keep it simple. Inspired by the Tang example, this clan claimed imperial authority, introduced a series of reforms designed to centralize Japanese politics. The imperial house established a court modeled on that of the Tang, instituted a Chinese-style bureaucracy, implemented an equal field system, provided official support for Confucianism and Buddhism, and in the year 710 moved to a new capital city at Nara that was a replica of the Tang capital at Chang'an. Never was Chinese influence more prominent in Japan than during the Nara period. So this shows the great influence of China, but it's a little misleading because, as the text here says, it's during this period that China was sort of most influential, that the Japanese sort of took and embraced more of Chinese culture here than any other period forthcoming. In the sort of next period after the Nara period is the Heian period, and the Heian period, and we see here one of the great literary classics of the Chinese kind of ancient and medieval world, the tale of Genji, written by a woman named Murasaki Shigipu, and this. I mean, there were other women writers in Japan, other places, but it wasn't that often that sort of one took on this kind of iconic status, since we know women were subordinated to men in this society, like we have seen in China and everywhere else. But this was clearly the greatest piece of literature, and has sort of remained thought of as such ever since. Our text says for 4 centuries, Heian became the seat of a refined and sophisticated society. During the Heian period, local rulers on the island of Honshu, the Big Island, mostly recognized the emperor as Japan's supreme political authority. Unlike their Chinese counterparts, however, Japanese emperors rarely ruled, but rather served as ceremonial figureheads and symbols of authority, which is pretty much true. We'll see with the samurai and the shoguns that's it's pretty well known by people that watch movies on this or read about the shoguns and the samurai, that the emperors were always around, but it was the shogun, military warlord, that ruled. Although the danger of using little quotes like this is it leaves so much out, but the emperor had to be respected. So it's not that he had no say. It wasn't just entirely a figurehead. Why? Well, because in Japanese history, right up until the modern era, the emperor has always been seen as a sacred, godlike figure, and so the public has always tended to revere the emperors. So shoguns had to be somewhat careful in respecting the emperor and respecting even the emperor's wishes, for fear of angering the public and losing the public's support because of disrespect for the emperor. So they were figureheads. They didn't do day-to-day governing, but they had some political influence. More, I mean, Bentley's an expert on this more than I am, for sure. He's one of the greatest. Nonetheless, I think this is a little misleading. But if I put it in the full context of our text, it's partly my fault for that. Medieval Japan, then, and the samurai. Right, some of you are probably already fascinated by this and know something about it. It's one of those things that just seems to be interesting to Americans, and indeed it is. Between the 9th and 12th centuries, according to William McNeill, Japan's precocious imperial and bureaucratic government gave way to a military regime in which power depended upon rights over land, and upon personal loyalties between lords and vassals. Resemblances to European feudalism were fairly close. That's true. We'll see European feudalism coming up in a while, and there are quite a few similarities. A professional fighting class, the samurai, came to dominate Japan and developed a code of honor enforceable privately with the sword in cases beyond the scope of a superior lord's court. Adherence to this code marked the samurai off from the rest of the population. Local violence became chronic, punctuated by larger-scale warfare between rival coalitions of lords and vassals. In such a milieu, the military life acquired high prestige in direct contrast to Chinese disdain for soldiering. So I mentioned it once in an earlier unit, but the Chinese armies, of course, were the key overall to their power. East Asia, vast power there. The Chinese as a whole, in terms of their value system, they didn't place soldiers sort of very high, sort of on the social ladder of social status. In Japan, they very much did. Japan is somewhat reminiscent of Germany later on, or German, I don't mean the Nazis, well before the Nazis, but where German culture had sort of a separate, special place for its soldiers and officers in the military, and gave them extra respect. And that's certainly true here. The shoguns eventually come out of this as the warlords that are the most, at one time or another, are the most powerful ones, that have the most samurai, or most effective samurai on the battlefield, and they're able to force the other warlords into submission, and they kind of maybe not as in a centralized, official, effective way as in China, but they're able to unify the country at times. But that comes just on the other side of all of this. The development of complex society in Korea, and we just have a little bit of time here. Korea is also, I've never been there, but I'd like to go to South Korea, that is, at least right now. But we don't have enough time to do justice to all the countries, peoples, culture of the world, unfortunately. And here we're primarily still talking about China's influence overall. So our text says, during the 7th century, Tang armies conquered much of Korea before the native Shilla dynasty rallied to prevent Chinese domination of the peninsula. Both Tang and Silla authorities preferred to avoid a long and costly conflict, so they agreed to a political compromise. Chinese forces withdrew from Korea, and the Shilla king recognized the Tang emperor as his overlord. In theory, Korea was a vassal state in a vast Chinese empire. In practice, however, Korea was in most respects an independent kingdom, although the ruling dynasty prudently maintained cordial relations with its powerful neighbor. Thus, Korea entered into a tributary relationship with China. So, again, I mentioned before that Korea is sort of the maybe best example, but there are many others, of states that sort of make this agreement. Instead of having to try to fight off China, which we'll probably lose doing anyway, let's make a deal with them and agree to bow down to them literally and figuratively, kowtow, send them tribute, go and pay respects, bow to the emperor, hand over the gifts, and go back, and then they'll pretty much leave us alone, which was pretty much true. And as our text tells us, that in the war that established this compromise, China saw or believed that it benefited from keeping the war short. So this will work out better for us. They were probably confident they could have conquered Korea and totally subdued it, but it would have been very costly in lives and treasure. So they decided, no, we don't need to do that. If we can make them a vassal state, get them to pay tribute to us, that's all we need. So again, we saw in a map in a previous slide that there was a sort of a ring of tributary states around Tang and Song China, and this would continue for some time. But of course, there's lots of differences. Korea has always had and still does its own unique culture, and so they differed in many respects. Most notably, for our purposes, aristocrats and royal houses dominated Korean society much more than was the case in China. Korea never established a bureaucracy based on merit, such as that of the Tang and Song, although our text does say that they did institute the civil service exams and all that. It just wasn't as crucial in deciding who got the jobs and who didn't. But in the royal houses dominating, the aristocrats dominating, that we can see of, okay, the nobles in Korea retained more power than they did in China, but royal houses means the emperors, the rulers. Well, what that means is that the royal houses in Japan tended to stay in place for longer. We have seen that the destabilizing feature of what's otherwise a remarkably stable Chinese history is that it's one family after another that ends up becoming emperor from one part of China or another, succeeded by another and yet another. So that didn't happen as much in Korea. The development of complex society in Vietnam. Bentley, again, says Chinese relations with Vietnam were far more tense than with Korea. When Tang armies ventured into the land that Chinese called Nam Viet, they encountered a spirited resistance on the part of the Viet people who had settled in the region around the Red River. Tang forces soon won control of Viet towns and cities, and they launched efforts to absorb the Viets into Chinese society. The Viets readily adopted Chinese agricultural methods and irrigation systems, as well as Chinese schools and administrative techniques. Viet elites studied Confucian texts and took examinations based on Chinese-style education, and Viet traders marketed their wares in China. Vietnamese authorities even entered into tributary relations with the Chinese court. So again, a lot of influence on the Chinese, a lot of influence on another neighboring people. Yet the Viets resented Chinese efforts to dominate the southern land, and they mounted a series of revolts against Tang authorities. As the Tang dynasty fell, the Viets won their independence and successfully resisted all the later Chinese efforts at imperial expansion to the south. So Vietnam put up not only a spirited resistance, but what in the end was a successful resistance. After for a time being dominated by China, they were able to throw off the yoke of Chinese power. And finally, like Korea, Vietnam differed from China in many ways. Many Vietnamese retained their indigenous religions in preference to Chinese cultural traditions. And just to pick out another one, women played a much more prominent role in Vietnamese society and the economy than did their counterparts in China. Southeast Asian women had dominated local and regional markets for centuries and participated actively in business ventures. So that's a big difference, because you don't see really anything like that as a tradition, as part of the culture, accepted part of the culture in China or many other places for that reason. So Vietnam and Southeast Asia as a whole stands out in that way.